Here are 40 minutes of mushroom editing with Lightroom and a little bit of Photoshop. As always, I'm going to put a link to the raw files in the link of the description if you want to follow along. And now let's do this. Okay, for this scene I do want to change the background, make it look a lot warmer, but I would say let's just go through the basic stuff real quick. I'm going to change the profile to Adobe Standard just to lower the contrast a bit. I think this soft look works quite well for this scene. I'm also going to play around with the white balance. I do think bringing it down a notch makes it look a bit nicer. Also, I'm going to bring up the tint. And I'm raising the tint because I just want to reduce that heavy green color cast that's going on this image. Okay, exposure wise, I do want to bring down the highlights. This will in turn give us some more details on those mushrooms. So let's bring them down. Then I do want to raise the blacks. Again, this helps create a soft look for the image, which works quite nice. And I'm going to raise the whites just to introduce some more contrast overall. Perfect. I also want to make this shot look a little more crisp, so I'm going to add texture. At the same time, I'm bringing down the clarity to create some soft look overall. Now, raising the texture while reducing the clarity always seems kind of a bit contradicting, but the texture mainly affects those smaller details, like you can see right down below this mushroom. While bringing down the clarity nicely creates a soft look, kind of targeting the bigger details of an image. So those two paired together work quite nicely. I also want to bring up the vibrance, just like that. And I think we're already done with the basic stuff. Now, editing those mushroom shots, there are always huge improvements by applying masks. So let's do that. First off, I'm really not happy with the foreground. I do want to change that. So I'm going to use a linear gradient, just covering most of the foreground like this, and I'm going to bring down the exposure. At the same time, looking at the histogram, you can see there is underexposure happening in this area. So I want to prevent that by bringing up the blacks. Just a little bit should be enough. Now, as I said, I want to heavily focus on the background and make it look a lot warmer. So I'm going to use another linear gradient, just covering the background like this. And it's really important to mask out the mushrooms themselves. So I'm going to click on the mask, say subtract, and choose select subject. And as you can see, this will nicely remove those mushrooms from this mask. So what we need to do to change the background is to bring up the exposure. I'm going to raise it quite heavily. We don't have to worry about noise because this area is out of focus anyway. So let's bring it up like this. And at the same time, I want to bring down the clarity quite heavily, which makes this so much softer in the back. Okay, and for the warmth, we simply want to raise the temperature. Perfect, that looks so much better. Now let's add a little more light to the scene. I'm going to use a radial gradient coming in from the top. And again, I do want to subtract the subject from this mask. And once more, bring up the exposure. I'm also going to bring up the blacks, which will add some nice glow effect. And again, bring up the temperature. Wonderful. At this point, the subjects are starting to become a little too dark. So let's select them with a new mask. And what I want to do in here is to bring up the shadows. I think I'm also going to bring up the saturation a bit. And let's even add a bit of clarity. Okay, that looks great. I'm also going to add a radial gradient for the bottom part of the mushrooms right about here. And what I want to do here is to bring up the highlights, which should add some nice contrast. Exactly like this, perfect. And I even want to increase the whites. Okay, that looks great. And at this point, I want to add some kind of special effect. I want to create some custom bouquet with a bunch of masks. So let's create a radial gradient. Hold down the shift key to create a perfect circle. just like that. And we want to bring the feather down almost all the way, maybe right about here. And to create this bouquet ball effect, I'm going to bring up the exposure very, very slightly. I'm also going to increase the blacks. And I want to bring down the temperature. That should be nice. Let me place it somewhere else and make it bigger as well. Now I'm going to use the exact same mask and add another radial gradient. Again, holding down the Shift key to make it a perfect circle. And I'm just going to place a bunch of them all around the background area. Okay, another cool thing we can do with this is to say subtract and choose a linear gradient going up like this, kind of erasing the lower part of that bouquet ball right here. And this makes it look a little more realistic. Now let's create a new mask, and again I'm using a radial gradient. And with that mask we can kind of overlap the other already created bouquet balls like that. Again, bring up the exposure slightly, bring up the blacks, reduce the temperature, and that's it. Let me create another one. Actually, I think we need to bring up the exposure even further. Okay, and let's create another one right about here. Obviously, I don't want the bouquet ball to overlap the subject, so we're going to click on the mask and say subtract, choose subject. Just like that. And I'm also going to say subtract linear gradient and take away a part from that bouquet ball right here. Alright, I think this looks great. And just so you get an idea, let me deactivate the masks for a moment. We started with this, and with just a bunch of masks, turned this image into this one. Looks so much better. Now let's continue doing a bit of color grading. I'm going to head into the color mixer for that. I would say let's start with the hue. I want to make the yellow tones warmer, so let's bring the yellow hue down. I'm going to drop them quite heavily, giving them some more of an orange look. And at the same time, let's bring up the green tones to keep that fresh green color in the foreground. All right. Then let's head into the saturation tab. I'm going to bring up orange. And I'm going to bring down yellow. Let's raise the greens as well. Could even head into the luminance tab and bring up the green luminance a bit, just like that. All right. Now I also want to add a little bit of split toning. So let's go into the color grading tab, head into the highlights and set up the hue. The highlights for this image are mainly warm, so we want to keep that. Choose a warm hue and bring up the saturation. Nice. Then we want to add a little bit of vignetting in the effects tab. Just bring down the slider a tiny bit. And finally, in the calibration tab, I want to bring down the hue and raise the saturation some more. Now that's looking really, really good. One more thing I want to do, obviously the sharpening in the details tab. So now we're done with the raw adjustments for this image, but this is a focus stacking sequence, which means I have a bunch of different images, each with a different focal point. So we want to synchronize those settings. I'm going to select the first one, hold down the Shift key, select all the other images, and then click on Synchronize. Check all and hit Synchronize. Okay, and once this is done, we want to do the focus stacking, which we will do in Photoshop. So with the images still selected, right click, go to Edit In, and here we want to choose Open as Layers in Photoshop. And as you see, this will conveniently place all the images in one single Photoshop file. Now all we need to do is to again select all those layers, go to Edit, and first we want to auto align the layers. Without changing anything, hit OK. Now again, with all the layers still selected, go to Edit once more and choose Auto Blend Layers. Here we want to stack the images and hit OK. Okay, Photoshop is doing some funny business here with the top of the mushrooms, as you can see. I do need to fix that manually somehow, so let's go back into Lightroom. And I'm looking for something where the top of the mushroom is sharp. I think that one is pretty good, so I'm going to open it up one more time in Photoshop. I'm going to copy this image over by hitting Ctrl A and Ctrl C to copy it, and go to the other image and place it on top by hitting Ctrl V. Now again, we want to align the focus stacked image with the newly placed layer, so let's select them both, go to Edit and choose Auto Align Layers. And what I want to do now is I want to create a black layer mask for the newly added layer. So I'm holding down Alt key and click on the layer mask icon. And then I'm grabbing a white brush and I'm just starting to paint over those weird areas which were caused by the focus stacking. Okay, now it's far from perfect, but I think for this image it's good enough. Let's continue with image number 2. So again, for this image I want to make the whole shot a lot warmer. Let's start this in the basic tab. I want to change the profile to Adobe Landscape once more, and I do want to raise the temperature this time. Let's also raise the tint. Okay, to start the basic editing, I'm going to bring down the shadows, giving this image more contrast. I'm also going to bring up the whites. Again, this helps to add contrast. And I want to raise the blacks quite a bit, since we do have some underexposure. But this should fix it quite nicely. And let's bring up the vibrance. We can also carefully raise the texture a bit, but that should be enough. Now again, I want to quite heavily transform this image using a bit of masking. So let's go into the masking panel. I'm going to start using a linear gradient going from the top down. Just like that. I'm going to raise the exposure heavily. Again, we don't need to worry about noise in here since this area is out of focus, so we can raise the exposure quite dramatically. I'm also going to raise the temperature to add warmth, and that's it for the first mask. Now let's create another radial gradient, again coming down from the top. Make sure to bring the feather back to 100 and place it somewhere around here. This time I again don't want the subject to be affected, so I'm going to say subject and choose subject. Perfect. Now what I want to do is to further bring up the exposure in this particular spot. And I also want to bring up the blacks. And let's raise the temperature. Wonderful. Then let's work on the foreground. I'm going to create a linear gradient going up from the bottom like this. And I do want to bring down the exposure, making the bottom part slightly darker this way. And I'm going to bring down the temperature, just so we get a cool looking balance between the cold tones in the bottom with the warmer tones at the top. And let's also drop the saturation in the foreground. Okay. I'm going to add another linear gradient right away, right here for that out of focus area. And again, I am going to drop the exposure slightly. I also want to bring up the blacks, prevent underexposure, and then let's bring down the texture and the clarity. And we can raise the noise reduction and drop the sharpness to make this area look a little softer. So I do think I want to add one more radial gradient for the top part. Just about here, and again raise the exposure to create this light effect and bring up the temperature. Okay. At this point you can see the top of this mushroom has a very unnatural orange tone. This should be red. I want to change that. So let's create a radial gradient. Just like this. And I want to head into the point color tool, pick the eyedropper, click right on this mushroom. And we can see we are selecting an orange color tone, which we now want to shift more towards the red. So we can kind of shift the hue, bring it more into the red range, and also kind of bring up the saturation here, make it pop a little. Okay, so I do think we want to expand the range a bit in order to target more of that mushroom. We also can pick another color, and you see this is more a yellow color tone. Again, we can bring down the hue to bring it more in line with the rest of the mushroom. Again, I want to bring up the range here. Maybe bring down the saturation just a notch, like that. Okay, and finally, I do want to pick the top of the mushroom as well. Bring down the hue. Actually, no, let's not do this. Let's delete this swatch. I think I'm quite happy with how this is looking. Now again, I want to toggle the masks so you can see the difference from before to after. And again, that's a huge transformation using only masks. Let's continue by doing a bit of color grading. Again, let's start in the color mixer tab. And I want to start with the hue first. I want to bring down the yellow hue quite a bit, making the background again more like an orange color tone. And I'm going to bring the green hue down all the way for the same effect. This looks great. Now let's head into the saturation tab. I want to bring the red saturation up all the way, which makes this mushroom top look a little nicer. And I do want to bring down the orange saturation slightly, bring down the yellow saturation a bit, and the green saturation. This will kind of separate the red from the mushroom from the surrounding area. Then let's head into the luminance tab. And here we can play around with the red luminance, making it look a little more natural this way. I'm also going to bring up the green luminance just to add some more contrast like that. Okay, that looks great. Let's go into the split toning panel once more. I'm going to start with the highlights. Actually, I'm just going to use the highlights for this image. And again, we want to keep the hue nice and warm like this and bring up the saturation. Wonderful. Finally, I do want to add a bit of vignetting, so let's go into the effects tab, bring down the amount here, and that's it. Again, this is a focus stacking series, so we want to synchronize the settings with all the other shots. So let's select all the images down below, hit synchronize, check all, and once more hit synchronize. And once Lightroom is finished, we want to open them up in Photoshop again. So right click, add it in, open as layers in Photoshop. Let's just hope the focus stacking works better this time. I'm going to select all the images, go to edit, go to auto align layers, hit OK. And then we want to stack the images. So once more, head to edit, go to auto blend layers and hit OK. Okay, that's looking quite a bit better than the first try before. However, I still need to clean up this image a bit, especially in the foreground. So I want to merge everything just to keep it nicely organized here. And I'm going to duplicate that layer by hitting Ctrl J. Now let's grab the remove tool right there and start removing things. Really not sure why Photoshop's performance is so poor compared to the 2023 version, but it's really bothering me. Like, it's completely frozen right now. I don't know why. So let's keep removing this piece right here and hope Photoshop won't crash. It's just doing weird things all the time. It's so annoying.
One eternity later.
Okay, that took longer than expected, but I think it looks much cleaner this way. And I think we're done with image number 2 right here. Alright, let's continue with this mushroom. Let's go through the basic panel. I'm going to start this by changing the profile to Adobe Standard again to lessen the contrast. I'm also going to adjust the white balance, making this image look a little colder. I think a colder look makes sense for this scene. And I don't want to touch the tint this time, but I want to bring down the highlights a little bit. Then let's raise the shadows, tickling out some more details from those darker areas. And I'm also going to raise the blacks. Okay, so at this point we have a low contrast image. Don't worry, we are going to change that later. First, however, I want to bring up the texture, bring down the clarity, and then add vibrance. Perfect. Now, again, we want to transform this image using a bit of masking. I'm going to start using a linear gradient for the foreground, just like this. And I'm going to bring down the exposure, kind of creating some vignetting effect right here. I also want to bring down the whites. This will safely make this area darker without risking underexposure. So right here is a good spot, I think. Then I want to use a radial gradient covering this bright spot where the light is shining through on the top right side. Want to enhance it some more by adding glow. So I'm covering this shape here. And I want to bring up the blacks. I also want to bring down the temperature, giving this spot a colder tone. And then let's go down to the effects tab right here, bring down the clarity and the dehaze. Again, this just helps with the glow effect, which I think looks really cool for this scene. Now I'm going to create another radial gradient for our subject right here. And what I want to do in here is to just bring up the highlights, bringing some more attention to the subject. I'm also going to create another radial gradient, just like this, and bring up the whites, introducing some more brightness and contrast to this area. Wonderful. Now I want to continue working on the vignetting effect, so let's use a linear gradient covering the top part, not overlapping this bright part on the right, however, at least not too much. And I'm going to bring down the exposure, making the area darker this way. And let's bring down the temperature as well, introducing some stronger blue tones. Perfect. Let's use another linear gradient for the bottom right. Again, I don't want to overlap those brighter areas of the image, just this very corner. And I'm bringing down the exposure slightly and the temperature once more. Wonderful, this looks great. So I want to show the transformation once more without the masks and with the masks. Not as big as with the other two images, but still quite dramatic. So let's continue doing the color grading. Again, we want to start in the color mixer with the hue. And I want to bring up the orange hue slightly. I also want to bring down the yellow hue and the green hue. I'm not going to drop it too much like previously. I kind of want to keep those fresher green color tones, just bringing them down slightly. Now in the saturation tab, I'm going to bring up yellow. This will mainly affect the mushroom and the colors around it. I'm going to slightly drop the green tones and then bring up aqua and blue. I think I also want to head into the luminance tab, bringing up the yellow luminance slightly and the green luminance. This looks really cool with those brighter green tones. Okay, then let's head into the split toning. This time we are going to make use of the shadows and the midtones. I don't want to touch the highlights. So for the shadows and the midtones, I want to apply a cold color tone. So first set up the hue here, right in this range, and I'm bringing up the saturation. Let's do the same for the midtones, set up the hue to something cold, and bring up the saturation. Wonderful. And again, I do want to add a bit of vignetting in the effects tab, just bringing it down like this. And now let's head into the calibration tab. For this image, I do want to play around with all the sliders here. So first I'm going to bring down the red primary hue. I'm also going to bring up the saturation. Let's bring up green. I'm going to bring up both sliders here. And the same goes for the blue primary hue and saturation. Now, thanks to the calibration tab, we get a rather cold looking image, as you can see from before to after, with some really rich green color tones. I'm quite happy how this is looking. Again, this is a focus stacked image, so let's synchronize all the images below. And again, edit in, open as layers in Photoshop. Once Photoshop has loaded everything, make sure to select them all. Again, we want to align the layers once more. Hit OK. And then one more time, edit, auto blend layers, and OK. Another great result here. Again, I want to clean up this image. So first let's merge all the layers and then duplicate that layer by hitting Ctrl J. This time I think I'm just going to use the spot heating brush since the remove tool seems to lag pretty hard at the moment. So just going to get rid of a few things here. Actually, that doesn't look good. Let me redo that. Duplicate the layer and let's give the remove tool another try. I hope this is doing a better job this time. Roughly painting over this thing and let's see what's happening now. Looks better, it just takes 10 times more time. Honestly, it was never this bad. I don't know what's going on. It's so irritating. So there's another thing I want to remove right there in the back of the mushroom. Let's give it a try. I think we did remove enough and made this shot look a lot cleaner, however. So this is looking good for the third image. Let's continue with image number 4. So one more focus stacking sequence right here. We want to start again with the profile, going from Adobe Color to Adobe Standard. I also want to adjust the white balance, making it slightly warmer, just right about here. And I'm going to bring up the highlights. At the same time, I'm bringing down the shadows to create some contrast. And let's bring up the whites. I do think I want to raise the blacks as well, so let's give it a try. Okay. Again, we want to bring up the texture, just giving the image more sharpness in those smallest details. And then let's bring down the clarity and raise the vibrance. Lovely. So for this image, there's not much masking to be done. I just want to use a linear gradient for the bottom part because I think this is just way too bright down here. And what I want to do is to bring the exposure down in this linear gradient. I also want to bring the contrast up. For more contrast, we can raise the highlights. And I'm going to drop the shadows. And let's also drop the blacks. And maybe even the temperature, just a little bit. Okay, quite like how this foreground is looking this way. So we can go right ahead into the color grading with just this one mask applied. Again, we want to start in the color mixer with the hue, and I want to bring up the yellow hue. This will really help introducing some of those fresher green color tones, which I like for this scene. I'm also going to bring up the green hue for the same effect. Just look at that. This looks wonderful. Let's also head into the saturation tab and just slightly bring down the green saturation. And I want to go into the luminance tab and bring up the green luminance, creating some more contrast. Let's see, I can bring down the yellow luminance to make the top of the mushroom a little more visible with more detail. Okay, we're almost done already with this one. Let's go into the calibration tab. I want to bring up the blue primary hue and saturation very slightly. And I do want to add a little bit of vignetting in the effects tab, just like this. Okay, so let's synchronize all the images for the focus stacking. And go ahead, open them up in Photoshop. So you know the procedure, go to Edit, go to Auto Align Layers, hit OK. And again, go to Edit, Auto Blend Layers, and hit OK. That looks wonderful. I do want to merge everything again, and so there's just one more sensor spot I want to get rid of. And that's about it for this image. So let's continue with image number 5. So this one is another one where I do want to apply some more creative effect with those bouquet balls. Let's start in the basic tab by changing the profile to Adobe Landscape for more saturation. I'm not changing the white balance. I want to bring up the highlights, creating more contrast. I also want to bring up the whites, just around here. And let's bring down the shadows to further bring up the contrast. And then I'm raising the blacks just to balance things out a little. Okay, we then want to bring up the texture and drop the clarity. I even think I want to bring down the vibrance just a notch, right about here. So this is looking quite good. By the way, you can already see some grain in the background. That's because I shot that at ISO 6400, but we can fix that later with the noise reduction. What I want to do now is the masking, and I want to start using a radial gradient covering pretty much the center like this. And I want to bring up the exposure, creating this really cool looking light effect. I do think I want to subtract the subject here to not make it too bright. I also want to increase the blacks in this area and bring up the temperature to create this warm light effect. Wonderful. Now let's work on the foreground for a moment. Again, I'm just using a linear gradient to target that blurry foreground, and I'm going to bring down the exposure, making it darker. And let's bring up the temperature. All right. Now let's create one more radial gradient. I'm covering pretty much all of the center of the image like this, and I'm going to invert it. The reason is because I want to create some kind of vignetting effect. And I'm doing this by bringing down the whites. And I do want to bring down the temperature for the outer areas of this shot. Perfect. And finally, I do want to add bouquet, so I'm going to use a radial gradient, hold down the shift key to create a perfect circle. And we want to bring down the feather for this effect. Right about here, maybe. Okay. So I'm slightly raising the exposure. Let's also raise the blacks and bring down the temperature. Okay, let's see. I think that looks good. I'm going to add a bunch of other radial gradients to this mask with different sizes, of course. And we can make use of the subtract button using a linear gradient to make this effect more realistic, just like that. Let's see, I think I want to add one more radial gradient mask. Okay, that looks awesome. Now let's work on the colors for a moment. I kind of want to shift the look more towards a warmer scene. Let's head into the color mixer first. I want to work on the saturation only here, just bringing up the orange tones. And let's bring up yellow as well. At the same time, I'm bringing down the green tones. So I'm kind of separating the warmer tones from green at the moment, just to emphasize the warmth in this image. Okay, then the split toning. I do want to work on the highlights only, giving them a very warm color tone somewhere around here. And let's bring up the saturation. Wonderful. Finally, I'm going to head down into the calibration tab and simply bring down the blue primary hue. And that's it for this image. Oh, I totally forgot. We want to reduce the noise in this image. So let's go into the details tab. And we want to click on denoise right here. All right, preview looks good as always with that AI denoise. So let's click on enhance. And here we have it. Looks awesome. Let's continue with the final image. So here we're going to focus stack one more time with a ton of images. I hope this will work properly, but let's start again in the basic tab. So we want to change the profile to Adobe Landscape for more saturation. Then let's work on the white balance. I think making this a little colder works quite nice for this scene. So let's bring down the temperature and let's bring up the tint. Perfect. I'm going to bring down the highlights to get more details out of the mushroom tops. And I'm going to bring down the shadows for more contrast. Then let's bring up the whites. kind of to spread the histogram, introducing more brightness, and I'm going to increase the blacks to prevent underexposure. Wonderful. Then let's introduce texture and bring down the clarity and bring up the vibrance. That's it for the basic stuff already. Let's do a little bit of masking, and there is really not much involved in here. I'm going to use a linear gradient covering that autofocus background pretty much like this. Here I want to bring up the exposure. Let's raise it quite a bit here. And I'm going to raise the temperature as well, introducing some yellowness to that background. Perfect. Then I'm going to use another radial gradient. Make sure to set the feather back to 100. And I want it to come down from that top right corner. Make it really big. And I'm going to bring up the blacks in here and increase the temperature dramatically. Now I want to add 2 more radial gradients to create some kind of light ray effect coming down. So let's create one like this. Keep it very thin, but make it rather long, if that makes sense. Just like this. And what I want to do here is to heavily increase the exposure. I'm also going to heavily increase the blacks, just to create this light coming down. I think we can make it a little brighter. And I want to add 1 more radial gradient to this mask, just a bit shorter version of this light ray. I think this looks good. And again, that's already it for the masking part. Let's see how this works out later. I'm going to continue with a bit of color grading. Let's start in the color mixer with the saturation. I am going to bring up the orange tones. And let's bring up yellow and green. And that's about it, I think. Then I'm going to head into the split toning again with the highlights. Going to choose a warm color tone and heavily bring up the saturation. Wonderful. And finally, we want to go into the calibration tab and bring down the blue primary hue and raise the saturation once more. Okay, we do have a lot of noise in here as well, since I shot that at ISO 6400 once more, but I don't think I can apply that AI noise reduction since I'm going to focus stack. And this would take years for all the images you can see down here. So I think I'm just going to give it a try like this. Let's synchronize all the images. And then let's open them up all as layers in Photoshop. So let's see if this works. First we want to select all the layers and again align them. Go to Edit, Auto Align Layers and hit OK. Alright, then let's do the stacking. That kind of looks better than expected. However, the background is really strange. So what I want to do here is let's go to select and choose focus area. Let's see if this works. Of course, Photoshop is giving me a super hard time with all of this, but it seems to work. I do want to deselect a bit here. I'm going to use the quick selection for that. I'm going to take away this mushroom. Actually, no, we want to add this mushroom. Take away this area. Take away this part. Okay, now I'm going to invert that selection, since right now we have selected everything that's in focus pretty much. So I'm going to hit Ctrl Shift I, duplicate that layer by hitting Ctrl J, and you see we now have a selection for the background. What I want to do with that is I'm going to hold on the Control key and click on the thumbnail. Then we have the selection again, and now let's go to Filter, Blur, and let's choose Gaussian Blur. Just want to kind of get rid of that noise in the background by doing this. I'm going to use a radius of around 14 pixels and hit OK. So right around the edges it looks super weird, so I'm going to use a layer mask and let's brush over the edges using a black brush. to not lose any sharpness in here. So I think this looks quite good. Let's merge those two layers. And I'm using the spot healing brush to get rid of that sensor spot up here. And I also want to get rid of that thing on the left. Okay, we can also crop it slightly. But that's it for editing these mushroom images. So that was the first time I'm going with a long format video like this. Let me know what you think about it. But I also hope we were able to see the process for editing these mushroom images, for me at least, is kind of always the same. It just changes with the amount of masking and the amount or direction of the color grading. So if you have any questions about the editing or anything else, let me know in the comments of this video. And if you have watched it so far, thank you very much for doing so. See you guys next time.